My wedding was 3 weeks away when I picked up an envelope from the kitchen counter that had my fiance's name on it and a return address that made my stomach tighten before I even opened it because it said Collections Department in bold black letters across the top. The counter was already buried under wedding invitations, florist contracts, and seating charts, so at first I almost set it aside with the rest of the paperwork. But something about the weight of the envelope made me unfold the letter anyway. The paper inside was thick and formal, the kind that feels serious the second you touch it. And halfway down the page, there was a number printed in bold that didn't even look real at first. I read it again. Then I checked the name at the top of the letter just to make sure I hadn't made some kind of mistake. It was his name, his address, his account number. And the total balance sitting at the bottom of that page was more money than I had ever seen connected to the man I was about to marry. 6 figures. I was still staring at that number when something else finally clicked in my head, because for the past 2 months, my fiancé had been pushing harder than anything else during our wedding planning for one specific thing to happen before the ceremony: the prenup. At the time, he said it was about protecting both of us. Standing there in that quiet kitchen with a debt notice in my hand, it suddenly felt like something very different. When my fiancé first brought up the idea of a prenup right after we got engaged, I didn't think twice about it, because my grandmother had left me a decent inheritance a few years earlier, and my family had always been practical about protecting assets. So when he said it would make everything clean and transparent between us, I actually respected him for suggesting it, instead of avoiding the conversation the way a lot of couples do when money starts getting uncomfortable. We sat down with a lawyer together about a month after the proposal and went through the basics, like 2 adults who believed they were building a stable future, separating premarital assets, outlining how finances would work if anything ever went wrong years down the road, all the normal things people talk about when they're trying to protect a marriage before it even begins. For a while, the whole process felt calm and responsible, the kind of conversation that made me feel like I had chosen the right person to build a life with. But sometime during the last 2 months of wedding planning, something about his attitude toward the prenup started to shift in small ways that I couldn't fully explain at the time because none of the moments felt big enough to confront on their own. He started asking about the signing deadline more often than before. Casually at first, then more directly, like he wanted to make absolutely sure the paperwork would be finalized before the rehearsal dinner. One night, I was standing in the kitchen sorting through RSVP cards while he walked out to check the mailbox, even though he had already brought the mail in earlier that afternoon. And when I teased him about becoming unusually dedicated to postal deliveries, he laughed it off and said he was just making sure we didn't miss anything from vendors. At the time, it sounded harmless, but looking back now, that small detail keeps replaying in my head, because it wasn't the only strange moment. A few days later, I mentioned that my lawyer wanted to review the final version of the prenup again before signing, and he immediately asked whether that could slow things down past the wedding date, which surprised me because we still had almost 3 weeks left before the ceremony, and there was no real reason to rush. I remember the way he stood there, leaning against the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through his phone while he asked that question, like the answer mattered more than he wanted me to notice. At the time, I brushed it off as wedding stress, because planning a wedding turns everyone a little strange. But standing there now with that collection letter in my hand and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the apartment around me, those little moments suddenly felt less like harmless stress and more like clues that my brain had quietly filed away without fully understanding them yet. If you want to see what happened next, stay with me. And if you like stories that reveal what people try to hide, don't forget to like and subscribe. The first letter should have been enough to stop my heart on its own, but what made the situation truly unsettling was what happened when I started opening the rest of the mail that had been sitting on the counter, because suddenly every envelope felt heavier than the last. The second letter had the same tone as the first one: formal language, reference numbers, payment warnings written in that cold legal style that makes everything sound more serious than it already is. and by the time I reached the paragraph explaining that the account had been transferred to a third-party collection agency after months of missed payments, my hands had started trembling just enough that the paper made a faint rustling sound every time I shifted it. I checked the name again just to make sure the letter wasn't meant for someone else with a similar address, but the account number and the full name printed across the top matched him perfectly. Then I opened the third envelope. This one referenced a completely different creditor, another balance that had apparently been sitting unpaid long enough to trigger warnings about potential legal action if the debt remained unresolved. I remember sitting down slowly in the kitchen chair because the room suddenly felt too quiet and too still for what I was reading. By the time I spread the documents across the table in front of me, there were 4 separate notices sitting there, each one referencing a different account. And when I added the balances together on the calculator app on my phone, the number that appeared on the screen made my stomach drop all over again. $182,000. I stared at the total for a long moment, hoping I had typed something incorrectly, but the math didn't change no matter how many times I entered the numbers again. What made the realization sink deeper than the amount itself was the memory of a specific paragraph inside the prenup agreement we had reviewed with the lawyer a few weeks earlier, a section that clearly stated each partner would remain fully responsible for any financial obligations that existed before the marriage, and that those debts would remain legally separate from shared marital assets. At the time, it sounded like common sense. Sitting there now, surrounded by collection notices with his name printed across every page, that paragraph suddenly looked less like a mutual protection clause and more like a carefully placed wall that would prevent his financial disaster from touching anything that belonged to me the moment we became legally married. And the more I thought about the urgency he had been showing lately about signing the document before the wedding date, the more those small, strange moments from the past few weeks began lining up in a way that made the entire situation feel less like an unfortunate financial secret and more like something that had been planned quietly behind my back while we were sending out invitations and choosing wedding flowers. If you want to see what happened next, stay with me. And if you like stories that reveal what people try to hide, don't forget to like and subscribe. I left the letters spread across the kitchen table exactly where they were because some part of me wanted to see what his face would look like when he realized I had found them. And when the front door opened later that evening, the first thing he noticed wasn't me sitting in the chair, but the stack of documents laid out in front of me like evidence waiting for an explanation. He stopped in the doorway so abruptly that the keys in his hand made a small metallic clink against the floor, and for a few seconds, neither of us said anything at all. The silence told me almost everything before he even started talking. When he finally spoke, the first explanation came out fast and defensive, something about temporary financial problems and a rough period at work that had gotten out of control before he realized how serious the balances had become. But the more he talked, the less convincing the story sounded, because none of it explained why the debts had never been mentioned once during the 2 years we had been building a life together, or why the prenup suddenly became so urgent the moment those collection notices started arriving in the mailbox. When I asked him directly whether he planned to tell me about the debt after the wedding was over, he didn't answer right away, and that hesitation was the moment something inside me shifted quietly into place. The next morning, I called the lawyer who had been reviewing our prenup agreement and asked a question that took less than 10 seconds to explain. What happens if one partner fails to disclose major financial liabilities before signing the document? The lawyer paused just long enough for the silence to feel meaningful before explaining that non-disclosure of significant debt could completely change how the agreement would be viewed if it were ever challenged later. That short conversation was enough for me to cancel the final appointment to sign the paperwork later that week. The wedding invitations were already mailed, the venue deposit was already paid, and half the guests had already booked flights to attend the ceremony. But standing there in that same quiet kitchen where I had first unfolded that collection letter, it became very clear that the piece of paper he had pushed so hard to finalize wasn't protecting the marriage we were about to start. It had simply revealed the truth about why the marriage needed protection in the first place.
If you want to hear more stories about the secrets people hide inside relationships, stay with me. And if you like stories that reveal what people try to hide, don't forget to like and subscribe.